Thank you, Mr. Rivers. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be here. I see some new faces that I haven't met yet, so hopefully if I haven't introduced myself yet, I will this afternoon after the service. But good to be here again. I think it was last August when I was here last, so glad to be back again and be able to visit with all of you. Well, recently, the news headlines have been dominated by the two shootings in New York and in Texas. On May 14th in Buffalo, New York, the shooting there resulted in 10 deaths, and then 10 days later, on May 24th, this past Tuesday, the Joab Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. 19 children and 2 adults were killed there. These are examples of some of the terrible injustices that we see in our world sometimes, in this case, carried out by 2 lost and confused young men. How do people respond to these things? How have they responded? There's a call for justice. There's a call for changes. In general, a desire to prevent these things from ever happening again. In Texas, parents and others are asking for answers from the law enforcement for how they handle the situation there. Others are using this as an opportunity to reignite the gun control debate. How have you responded? Perhaps anger and sadness, disgust. This is normal. We should feel these kinds of emotions because it is unjust. Everyone, whether it's us, whether it's those affected by this directly, everyone's motive is a desire for justice, whether we have the right we take the right steps or whether we don't, we share that common motive. People naturally have a strong sense of justice and fairness. Even as children, we can sense, we know when things are right and when they're wrong. So these 2 events that we're talking about here just in the introduction, just a small sample of what we see in the world, of injustice. Other things that we'll see are slavery, discrimination, corruption, exploiting the poor, lack of equality, so much more. As we introduce the topic today, I'd like to turn to Jeremiah chapter 12. We'll read 2 verses here where Jeremiah feels the same way we so often do. He asks God for justice. He asks the same questions we so often ask in our own minds of why things are the way they are. We'll read verses 1 and 2 in Jeremiah chapter 12. Jeremiah says, "Righteous are you, O Lord, when I plead with you. Yet let me talk with you about your judgments. Why does the way of the wicked prosper?" Why does the way of the wicked prosper? We ask this at times. Why are those happy who deal so treacherously? You have planted them. Yes, they have taken root. They grow. Yes, they bear fruit. You are near in their mouth, but far from their mind. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? I have asked this question myself many times. Even back in Jeremiah's day and way back to the time of Adam and Eve, nothing has changed. We see the world around us and we see the wicked prospering. When will this change? Why does God allow this? When will he bring justice? Is it even worth doing what's right? Well, from our human perspective, it doesn't always look like it, but God is a God of justice, and it is important to him as well. So I'd like to look at what the Bible teaches about justice today and what we should do as Christians when we see injustice in this world. I've titled the sermonette, "Justice for All." I looked up the definition for justice and for revenge. I'd like to share that with you here briefly. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines justice as fair treatment. Fair treatment. Wikipedia says that justice in its broadest sense is the principle that people receive that which they deserve. I think we all agree with those definitions. In the Bible, the Hebrew words that are translated justice can also be translated as righteous. So it's about doing right. On the other hand, we'll define revenge. It's defined by the Oxford Languages Dictionary as the action of inflicting hurt or harm on someone for an injury or wrong suffered at their hands. Oftentimes people confuse or perhaps combine these two things, justice and revenge. They might tell themselves, I'm going to get my justice, I'll get my revenge, as if they were the same thing. Or he got what he deserved, which may be true. So what determines true justice? How do we know if the punishment is deserved? God defines that for us in his Holy Scriptures. He's the source of true justice. And I'd like to share some stories of justice and revenge in the Bible to help illustrate the two ways that justice can be brought out. The two examples of the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. The first example I'd like to look at is Joab. Joab was the commander of King David's army. We don't often focus on him, and he's somewhat of a supporting cast member, if you will. But I'd forgotten he actually happens to be David's nephew. It was David's sister's son. So he was related to David, and he was quite a scoundrel, really. He was not a good person and was quick to take matters into his own hands. He was always looking out for number one, always looking out for his own best interests. The first example that he provides for us is with man Abner. Abner, if you remember that name, he was a commander of the army of Israel. Early in King David's reign, he was over Judah, but he was not ruling over Israel yet. Saul's son Ishbosheth still ruled over Israel. They went to war, and Abner was the commander of the army of Israel, just as he was for Ishbosheth's father Saul. And during that battle, Joab's brother Asahel pursued him. He pursued Abner to kill him, but in the end, Abner prevailed and killed Asahel instead. Well, as you can imagine, this was very upsetting to Joab. So Joab and his other brother Abishai, during that same battle, tried to take revenge. They tried to get back at Abner, and they failed. Later on, Abner became angry with Ishbosheth and actually defected to David, to Judah. He decides to switch sides and join with David. So David allows him to come visit in peace and leave in peace. But Joab wasn't going to have that. As Abner left, Joab pulled him aside to speak to him in private, as you will, and he stabbed him in his stomach, and he died. He got his revenge. Was it justice, though? Another example, just briefly, of Joab, also with Absalom and Amasa. Joab also killed Absalom. When he rebelled against David, as a result, David demoted him as the commander of the army and replaced him with Amasa. So, of course, he wasn't having that either. And in the same sneaky way as he killed Abner, he killed Amasa as well. And shame on David for allowing him to then regain his position as the commander of the army. But he was, after all, his nephew. So here's an example of someone who did it the wrong way. And for a long time, it appeared as though he was going to continue to prosper. Why do the wicked prosper? Did he really get away with it? No, in the end, he suffered the consequences of his actions, the consequences of taking matters into his own hands. When David was near death, Joab made one more grave mistake. He decided to join with Adonijah, who was trying to take the throne from Solomon. And David advised Solomon to swiftly have both Adonijah and Joab executed, which he did. So Joab fled to the tabernacle, and he grasped the horns of the altar, which was to say that he was asking for mercy and claiming innocence. But he was not, of course, and so he was killed there. So in the end, he suffered the same dishonorable death that he had brought on so many others. So there's an example of what some might call justice when it's in fact revenge, the wrong way to do things. In contrast, his master, David, approached justice the right way. David made mistakes, of course, but when it came to allowing God to bring justice, he left us a great example with how he handled his awkward relationship with Saul. He did an excellent example of showing what to do. He never did any wrong towards Saul, not once. From the very beginning with Goliath, he pursued the things that benefited Saul. He repeatedly fought the Philistines for Saul. He spoke highly of Saul even when others were not. He soothed him with the harp. He didn't do anything to deserve the relentless pursuit of Saul to kill him. From a human perspective, we would say that he had every right to kill Saul, to take his life, and it would be self-defense. But he refused. Twice he had the opportunity to take Saul's life. The first was in the cave in En-Gedi, where he and his men were hiding, and Saul came in unaware, and he cut off the corner of his robe, and even felt bad for doing that, but he didn't take his life. A second time, David snuck into Saul's army camp at night, and his Joab's other brother, Abishai, was with him there and urged him to kill Saul. Said, "The Lord has delivered him into your hands." But David refused. He said, "No, God will bring justice to pass. God will strike Saul, or perhaps he'll die in battle, or die of old age." But he said, "God forbid that I should strike the Lord's anointed." David waited on God's justice. How patient are we with justice? David waited for 15 years before he would actually become king. After he was anointed, it was 15 years before he ever became king. I don't think waiting on God's justice was very easy for him, just as it isn't for us. But the Bible is clear. The Bible is clear about justice and revenge. We'll reference Romans chapter 12, verse 19, just quote it here briefly. Reference Romans 12:19 says, "Do not avenge yourselves. Do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." It is clear that we should not take justice into our own hands like Joab did. So what should we do? We've been talking about what not to do. We looked at an example of someone waiting patiently in David. But what should we do? Should we just throw up our hands and do nothing when we see injustice? No. Should we just turn a blind eye to the world's injustice and just stop caring? No, that's not the answer either. Should we let our love wax cold? No. There were some very good articles in a recent issue of Discern, well, I guess it was last fall, September, October issue of Discern magazine. And Jeremy Lawler wrote an article, and he wrote about two ditches when it comes to justice. The one ditch, on the one hand, you stop caring, just as the questions we were asking. You stop caring, you do nothing, you wash your hands of it and say, well, that's just the way it is. But that isn't being a light. That isn't loving your neighbor as yourself. And then on the other hand, we can join the cause and get into the trenches, try to make the world a better place. Sounds like a better option, right? But we're not of this world. It's a broken system that must be replaced, not repaired. Joining the cause is joining the other team. So what are we to do then? We don't go in either ditch. We drive in the middle of the road. We do good and we help people when we can, just like the Good Samaritan. He wasn't like the priest or Levite who went into the one ditch and just didn't care, crossed over to the other side of the road and did nothing. He also didn't start up a campaign and try to fix the justice system. He didn't try to hunt down the band of robbers and bring justice in his own way. No, what he did was he helped the man who was wounded. He helped the man who was wounded. I'd like to begin concluding by turning to Psalm 37. Psalm 37, verses 1 through 11. The world is full of evil. It is full of injustice. So many people treated unfairly. Sometimes we are those recipients, right? We're treated unfairly at times. When we're mistreated by others or discouraged by what we see in the world, when we start to ask that question like Jeremiah, how long will the wicked prosper? When, God? When will you bring justice? This is a great place to turn for encouragement. It reminds us what God's perspective is on justice. We'll begin reading verse 1 of Psalm 37. Do not fret because of evildoers, nor be envious of the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like grass and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and feed on his faithfulness. Delight yourself also in the Lord, and he shall give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. For he shall bring forth your righteousness as the light, and your justice as the noonday. Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Do not fret because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who brings wicked schemes to pass. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Do not fret, it only causes harm. Verse 9, for the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait on the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. For yet a little while, and the wicked shall be no more. Indeed, you will look carefully for his place, but it shall be no more. But the meek, they shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. True and lasting peace is coming. It is coming. What should we do in the meantime? Well, we must have faith and trust in God. He always fulfills his promise. He promises to bring the wicked to justice, and he promises to reward the righteous. We should never take our revenge or justice into our own hands like Joab. We should do as David did. We wait, and we wait patiently on God's justice. And while we wait, we have the opportunity to do good to others.